Nehiwak of this continent refer to indigenous peoples as Aisinoak. We've existed here since each of our independent creation stories. We've established our own treaties, trade routes, and reciprocal relationships, ensuring we use all of the being we kill or harvest. Until the last few generations, indigenous peoples spoke upwards of 7 languages to trade with other indigenous communities. The pragmatic and spiritual indigenous trade of usable materials would not be valued by European powers. European nations, now with artillery and firearms, would instead value gold and silver as currency to finance their now globalized mercantilism. Christopher Columbus was responsible for the abduction, murder, and trafficking of Taino children, those ages 9 or younger, into gold mining or sex slavery. That is, the issue of missing and murdered indigenous women has existed since Columbus landed, and it is only fueled by a profit-oriented motivation. The Doctrine of Discovery would then be signed in 1493. This determined that peoples who were not Christian were not people, and thus their land was not occupied. This set out European colonization of lands, instantly leading to the theft of land from indigenous peoples, as decided upon by European nations and endorsed by Pope Alexander VI. Upon returning to Spain from his third exploration in 1500, Columbus was imprisoned for his treatment of the Taino. He made the case to spread religion to those indigenous peoples who were not Christians, and that children could be enslaved for profit in gold. Through this case, Columbus was pardoned by King Ferdinand of Castile, who then also funded Columbus's 4th voyage. This ongoing and endorsed behavior would set the precedent for treatment of indigenous peoples on the northern and southern continents. Indigenous systems of trade and war would gradually be disrupted through influence of colonial powers. Settling nations would need farms to be independently profitable by the 1600s. European governments would use force to move indigenous peoples to bring in farming settlers from European nations. While Canada made laws making it mandatory for those younger and younger to go to residential schools and learn how to farm, the reserves that indigenous peoples were forced to go to were often not even arable. The Hudson Bay Company established its first post in Nehiwak homelands in 1667. The fur trade, supported by the expansive trade of guns and horses in the early 1700s, would cull fur-bearing species for profit instead of relational kinship. The Hudson Bay Company would claim illegitimate ownership of nearly 1/3 of the lands which are now colonially referred to as Canada. Instead, the Hudson Bay Company would name the area Rupert's Land, after Prince Rupert. Ultimately, it was slave-based production combined with the wholesale extraction of indigenous lands which fueled international profit. The African Company of Merchants were European-owned slave-trading companies, which began enslaving indigenous peoples from African nations, all for colonial profit. Slavery still exists in several forms today, while indigenous women and girls in the lands colonially referred to as Canada are still disproportionately stolen and trafficked, with indigenous men making up the largest per capita population in prisons, working for a maximum of $6.90 a day. The first industrial revolution, around manufacturing and the steam engine, came in the 18th century. The early 1700s also brought with it amplified disease, seeing more devastating deaths directly associated with smallpox, measles, influenza, and whooping cough. By the late 1700s, European mercantilism became American capitalism, and with it came the corporation. Individual profit took precedence over sustainability. The second industrial revolution followed in the late 19th century. This saw the combustion engine, standardization, and industrialization. This also saw the demand for oil and gas. While the first 7 treaties were signed between 1870 and 1877, the remaining treaties, 8 to 11, would be signed when gold, oil, and other of Earth's life forces were discovered and dedicated to extraction for capitalistic profit. Indigenous peoples of the prairies had subsisted on the millions of bison which had pre-existed colonial farming and agriculture. However, the last free-roaming bison would be culled by 1883, where the hide was likely sold to Europe for robes and the bones likely used for sugar refining. Where colonizing nations have affected the livelihood of indigenous peoples, the consequences have affected ancestral forms of governance, indigenous economies, and language fluency through necessary participation in either an English or French colonial language for trade and currency after the decline of the fur-bearing animals which were previously relied on for subsistence. Televisions, radio, and newspaper would dominate public opinion. These broadcasts were largely in English and French, which excluded the voices and claims to land of indigenous peoples. More recently, the third industrial revolution came in the mid-1960s with the microchip. Moore's law would determine that the power of the microprocessor would double every 18 months. This would largely be true, and with it, a new global dependence on mining to create digital technologies for the instant gratification and profit and long-term consequences. These technologies would see the mass production of the computer, and with it, a further Anglo-European bias in emergent technologies. And with computer networks came hypercapitalism, and with that, the fourth industrial revolution into late-stage capitalism. Referred to colloquially as Industrial Revolution 4.0, we are now living in an era enforcing digital connectivity, algorithmic automation, and the powers of big data. Corporations like Google, Apple, and various social medias own our digital information without our consent. However, we are seeing an age of indigenous decolonization of the digital. Indigenous language fonts are only now just being developed, and indigenous peoples are using these intranet networks and language websites for our own learning and revitalization. We're building our own networks, we're creating our own resources, we're reconnecting to the land, and we're decolonizing the digital.